On the morning Eleanor Brooks was erased from her own life, the city of Chicago was wrapped in a quiet snowfall, soft enough to feel kind, sharp enough to cut. The kind of snow that made you think of second chances, while it froze your fingers to the bone. Eleanor stood in the kitchen of the brownstone she had lived in for 23 years, watching steam rise from a chipped blue mug. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. Every sound felt amplified, like the house was already empty and echoing back at her. She had been married to Thomas Brooks for 27 years, long enough to forget who she had been before she learned how to compromise, to smooth her voice, to apologize even when she was right. Long enough to build a life so solid she believed it couldn't be taken apart without warning. She was wrong. The envelope sat on the table, cream-colored, heavy, legal, final. Thomas hadn't even been there when it arrived. He had left early, as he always did now, a quick kiss on the cheek that landed somewhere between obligation and guilt. His cologne still lingered in the hallway, expensive and unfamiliar. New. Everything about him had become new lately. New clothes, new smile, new silence. Eleanor opened the envelope with careful fingers, as if the paper might bite. She read the words twice, then a third time, then she sat down. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The sentence felt unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life, someone reckless, someone loud. Not Eleanor Brooks, the woman who never missed a mortgage payment, who packed lunches with handwritten notes, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and the names of Thomas's coworkers. She turned the page. Her breath caught. There it was, the line that made the room tilt. Petitioner requests full ownership of the marital home and associated assets, citing respondent's lack of financial contribution. Eleanor laughed, a small, broken sound. Lack of financial contribution. She had quit her job 20 years ago because Thomas said it would be temporary, because daycare cost too much, because someone had to be home when the kids got sick, because his career needed flexibility, because love meant sacrifice. Temporary turned into permanent. Now it was being used as proof she was worth nothing. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, Lily. Dad said you're taking the divorce really hard. Maybe give him space. He's been under a lot of stress. Eleanor stared at the screen. No question mark. No, are you okay? Just instructions. She typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. In the end, she said nothing. By noon, the locks had been changed. She discovered this when her key wouldn't turn. The locksmith stood awkwardly behind her, holding paperwork Thomas had signed that morning. Everything was legal. Everything was clean. You'll need to collect your personal items later, with notice. Eleanor nodded, because nodding was easier than screaming. She walked away with her purse, her phone, and the coat on her back. 23 years reduced to what she could carry. She sat on a bus bench as snow gathered on her hair, watching cars pass like her life hadn't just been quietly destroyed. That's when she made a decision. Not out of rage, not out of revenge, but out of something colder, resolute. If they wanted to erase her, she would rewrite herself. And when she returned, they would remember her name. The first night Eleanor slept on a stranger's couch, she learned what survival sounded like. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered. The whisper came from the old radiator in Marlene's apartment, hissing, knocking, breathing like a tired animal. Marlene had been Eleanor's neighbor for years, the kind you wave to but never really know. A retired nurse, widowed. Sharp eyes, soft voice. When Eleanor rang her bell with numb fingers and no story prepared, Marlene took one look at her face and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. No questions. Now Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, fully dressed, boots still on. Her purse sat on the floor beside her like a loyal guard dog. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the envelope, the sentence, lack of financial contribution. She hadn't cried yet. That scared her more than tears would have. At 3:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. A voicemail. From Thomas. She let it ring out, then stared at the notification until the screen dimmed. At 4:02 a.m., another message arrived. From Lily. Dad says you're making this harder than it needs to be. Why won't you just talk to him? Eleanor turned the phone face down. The whisper of the radiator continued. She listened. It sounded like endurance. Morning came gray and unapologetic. Marlene slid a mug of coffee across the small kitchen table. You can stay a few days, longer if you need. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the mug. It was too hot. She welcomed the pain. Thank you, she said. Her voice surprised her. Steady, low, like it belonged to someone else. Marlene studied her the way nurses study patients, reading what isn't said. You going to tell me what happened? Eleanor considered lying. Instead, she told the truth. All of it. The envelope, the locks, the silence from her children. When she finished, Marlene exhaled slowly. They always think quiet women won't fight, she said. Eleanor blinked. Fight? Marlene gave a thin smile. Survive first, fight later. By noon, Eleanor was downtown. She didn't remember deciding to go there. Her feet just knew the way. The city library rose in front of her like a cathedral, stone and glass, patient and unjudging. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her, the smell of paper and dust and possibility. She found a computer, logged in as a guest, typed her own name. Nothing. She tried again, added her married name, her old address. Still nothing. Then she searched Thomas. Pages appeared instantly. Articles, panels, photos. Thomas Brooks, senior partner. Thomas Brooks, visionary leader. Thomas Brooks, advocate for ethical corporate reform. Eleanor stared at the screen. Ethical. She scrolled, and there, buried deep, she saw it. An old article from 22 years ago, a startup acquisition, a brief mention of strategic domestic support enabling rapid growth. Her stomach tightened. That had been her. She printed the page, folded it carefully, put it in her purse. The job center smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Eleanor stood in line behind a man arguing about unemployment benefits and a woman clutching a toddler with tired eyes. When it was her turn, the clerk looked at her resume and frowned. You've been out of the workforce a long time, the woman said. I was raising children, Eleanor replied. The clerk nodded, sympathetic but unmoved. We'll see what's available. What was available paid barely enough to survive. Eleanor took 2 shifts cleaning offices at night. The first evening, she wiped fingerprints off glass walls while men in suits laughed in conference rooms. Their words blurred into background noise. Until she heard a name. Brooks. She froze. Different building, different company, same world. She finished the shift without a word. At midnight, she sat alone on the L train, hands aching, spine stiff. Across from her, a woman about her age typed furiously on a laptop. On the screen, spreadsheets, models, numbers. Eleanor felt something stir. She remembered nights balancing the household budget down to the penny, remembered negotiating with creditors, remembered reading contracts Thomas didn't bother to explain. She wasn't unskilled. She had just been unpaid. Marlene found her at the kitchen table days later, surrounded by library books, accounting basics, business law, digital certifications. You planning to go back to school? Marlene asked. Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were different now, focused. "I'm planning to stop pretending I know nothing," she said. She enrolled in free online courses, studied during the day, cleaned offices at night, slept 4 hours when she could. Her hands shook from exhaustion, but her mind sharpened. Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, an email arrived. "We reviewed your assessment. Are you available for a remote contract role?" Eleanor read it 3 times, then once more. She replied with one word: yes. The first paycheck wasn't large, but it was hers. She framed the deposit confirmation and placed it beside her bed. Marlene raised an eyebrow. "That important?" "It's proof," Eleanor said, "that I exist." Thomas called again. This time, she answered. "You can't keep avoiding this," he said, irritation barely concealed. "The lawyers need—" "I'm not avoiding anything," Eleanor replied calmly. "I'm documenting." Silence. "You don't have the resources for a long fight," he said finally. Eleanor smiled. He couldn't see it. That made it better. "I'm building them," she said, "just like I built yours." She hung up. Her hands were steady. Outside, the city moved on. Cars, people, lives colliding and separating without apology. Eleanor opened her laptop, created a new folder. She named it carefully. Brooks. Inside, she placed contracts, articles, emails, memories. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was foundation. And foundations, once set, were hard to erase. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as competence. Eleanor learned this on a Tuesday night at 1:43 a.m. when her contract supervisor emailed her by mistake. The subject line read, "Internal review, Brooks adjacent accounts." Adjacent. The word snagged her attention like a hook in fabric. She shouldn't have opened it. She did anyway. Inside were spreadsheets layered with complexity, shell vendors, accelerated depreciation schedules, charitable offsets that looked generous on paper and predatory underneath. It was sophisticated, elegant, and deeply familiar. Her pulse slowed. She had seen this before. Not on screens. On napkins. On the backs of envelopes, on legal pads Thomas left scattered across their dining table late at night while he talked through deals aloud, assuming she was listening with the ears of a wife instead of the mind of a partner. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could still hear him. "It's just moving numbers, Ellie, nothing you'd be interested in." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She corrected 3 errors in under 5 minutes. Then she added notes. Precise, unemotional, impossible to ignore. She sent the file back. At 7:12 a.m., her phone rang. "Who are you?" the voice on the other end asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I'm the contractor you hired." A pause. "Have you done forensic accounting before?" "No," Eleanor said honestly, "but I've lived with it." Silence again. Then, "Can you take on more hours?" "Yes." Her workload tripled. So did her confidence. She began to see patterns others missed, not because she was smarter, but because she had been invisible long enough to observe everything. Money moved like people did. It lied. She built models at night and cleaned offices less. Her hands stopped aching. Her back straightened. Marlene watched the change with quiet approval. "You walk differently now," she said one evening. Eleanor considered that. "I remember who I was before I learned to shrink." The first real offer came from a startup in Seattle. Remote, discreet, high stakes. They were preparing for acquisition and suspected their own CFO of skimming through related entities. "We just need confirmation," the CEO said on a video call. Eleanor nodded. What she found was dramatic. Within 48 hours, she mapped the money trail like a nervous system, every impulse, every reflex, every lie. When she presented her findings, the room went silent. "That's airtight," the CEO said finally. Eleanor closed her laptop. "I'll send the invoice," she said. She named her price carefully. They paid it without negotiating. She opened a new bank account, then another, then a third, this one under an LLC name she chose with intention, E. Brooks Consulting. No married name, no explanation, just ownership. Her first business card arrived a week later. She held it between her fingers, surprised by its weight. It felt real. Thomas found out by accident. A colleague congratulated him on his wife's impressive pivot at a networking event. That night, his text came fast. "Since when are you consulting?" Eleanor waited an hour before replying. "Since always. I just stopped doing it for free." The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again, then nothing. Her children called less. When they did, the conversations were polite, surface level, as if success had complicated their loyalty. Eleanor led it. She was done begging for recognition from people who benefited from her silence. One evening, reviewing a new client's files, she froze. A familiar structure, a familiar charity, a familiar shell. Her breath slowed. She opened the metadata. Brooks Foundation Holdings. The foundation Thomas publicly praised for its ethics, the same structure she had once suggested and he had dismissed. Her hands didn't shake. She documented everything. Screenshots, timelines, cross-references. Then she encrypted the folder. This wasn't a weapon. Not yet. This was leverage. At 2:06 a.m., Eleanor stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like a circuit board. She understood now. They hadn't underestimated her intelligence. They had underestimated her memory. And memory, applied correctly, became power. She closed the laptop. Tomorrow, she would take her first meeting with a law firm, not as a wife, not as a respondent, but as a consultant. And the woman they erased was almost ready to be seen again. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the river. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nerves, but habit. She wore a charcoal blazer she bought secondhand and had tailored herself. It fit perfectly. That mattered more than the label. The receptionist smiled politely, neutral, trained. "Ms. Brooks?" "E. Brooks," Eleanor corrected gently. The woman nodded and led her into a conference room where the city stretched wide and indifferent beyond the windows. 3 attorneys waited inside. 2 men, 1 woman, all sharp, all assessing. They didn't offer coffee. They offered silence. Eleanor placed her laptop on the table and connected it to the screen. "I'm not here about my divorce, at least not directly." That earned her their full attention. She clicked. Charts bloomed onto the screen. Clean. Undeniable. "This is a charitable foundation, public-facing, politically protected." She clicked again. "This is how it's actually being used." The woman attorney leaned forward. "That's a serious allegation." Eleanor nodded, "Which is why I'm not alleging, I'm documenting." She showed them timelines, entity overlap, deferred tax shelters that cross state lines with surgical precision. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Finally, one of the men spoke. "Why bring this to us?" Eleanor said, "Because you specialize in clean hands, and because I need representation that doesn't underestimate me." The woman attorney smiled, just a little. "You understand this gives us leverage," she said. Eleanor met her gaze. "I understand it gives me leverage. You would be my translators." The smile widened. They took her on as a consultant first. That was strategic. It kept her separate from her divorce case while building a parallel narrative. Not abandoned spouse, but financial expert. Within weeks, subpoenas began to whisper their way through boardrooms. Not Thomas's. Not yet. But close enough that people started returning his calls slower. Eleanor watched it happen from a distance. Power, she learned, rarely moved forward. It moved sideways. Her divorce attorney, new, sharper, called her one afternoon. "You never disclosed these skills," he said, almost accusing. "I was never asked," Eleanor replied. A pause. "They're pushing for expedited settlement. That's new." Eleanor looked out the window. "Tell them I'm open to discovery," she said. Another pause. "That could get ugly." "Yes," Eleanor agreed calmly. "For them." Thomas requested mediation. He chose the venue. Neutral, elegant, controlled. He arrived confident, flanked by counsel, wearing the watch Eleanor bought him after his first promotion. He looked surprised when she didn't flinch. They sat across from each other like strangers. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he said quietly. "We did," Eleanor replied. "You handled it privately. I was excluded." His jaw tightened. "You're hurting the kids," he tried. Eleanor's eyes hardened. "I'm teaching them what erasure looks like." The mediator cleared his throat. Thomas's lawyer slid a document across the table. A revised offer. It was better, not enough. Eleanor didn't touch it. Instead, she slid her own folder forward. Inside were no accusations, only questions, legally phrased, carefully timed. Thomas flipped through them. His color drained. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Eleanor leaned back. "I was always in the room. You just never saw me." The mediation ended early. Outside, cameras waited not for them, but for another case in the building. Still, Thomas hesitated. "You don't have to destroy everything," he said. Eleanor paused. "I'm not destroying, I'm translating." She walked away. That night, her daughter called, for the first time in months. "Dad seems scared. What's going on?" Eleanor closed her eyes. "The truth," she said, at its own pace. Silence. Then, softly, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Eleanor answered honestly. "Because I was taught that love meant quiet." Back at Marlene's apartment, Eleanor opened her encrypted folder. She added one more document, a timeline labeled Disclosure Strategy. Dates, names, consequences. This was no longer about survival. It was about authorship. The law was a language she learned late, but she was fluent now. Power noticed Eleanor the way predators notice a shift in the wind, not all at once. At first, it was subtle. A delayed email, a meeting postponed without explanation, a board seat quietly vacated. Thomas felt it before he understood it. He stood in his office overlooking the city, phone pressed to his ear, listening to excuses dressed up as scheduling conflicts. "Yes, of course," he said smoothly for the third time that morning. "We'll reconnect next quarter." The line went dead. Next quarter. That phrase used to mean certainty. Now it meant avoidance. Eleanor read about the first crack in the business section, a short column, easily missed. Unnamed executive steps down amid internal compliance review. No details, no accusations, just smoke. She forwarded the article to her attorney with one word: progress. The firm invited her to a closed-door strategy session. No windows, no devices, only voices and intent. "We're not going public yet," the senior partner said, "but we're prepared." Eleanor nodded. Preparation is pressure. The attorney woman smiled. "You learn fast. I learned late, which makes me thorough." They discussed timing, jurisdictions, the difference between exposure and annihilation. Eleanor listened more than she spoke. She was done underestimating silence. Thomas's lawyer called hers. Again. This time, the offer included the house, full equity, no spousal support clause, a confidentiality addendum thick enough to choke on. Eleanor read it slowly. Then she shook her head. "Counter," she said. Her children came home for dinner that Sunday. Marlene set the table but stayed out of the room. The air felt fragile. Lily picked at her food. "You're changing," she said, finally. Eleanor met her gaze. "So are you." Her son, Mark, frowned. "Dad says you're trying to ruin him." Eleanor inhaled. "I'm trying to tell the truth. Ruin happens when lies can't stand anymore." Silence stretched. Then Lily asked the question Eleanor had waited for. "Did you help him build all this?" Eleanor nodded once. "Yes." Mark's voice was quiet. "Why didn't we know?" "Because I thought protecting your image of him mattered more than my reality." That night, Lily cried in her arms like she used to when she was small. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was movement. The leak didn't come from Eleanor. It never does. It came from a junior analyst trying to save his own career, a spreadsheet attached to the wrong email, a reporter who knew what to look for. By morning, Thomas's name was trending, not screaming headlines, questions. Always questions. Thomas showed up unannounced. Marlene opened the door, took one look at him, and stepped aside. Eleanor didn't invite him to sit. "You promised discretion," he said, voice tight. "I promised nothing. I offered silence. You chose urgency. You're destroying everything we built." Eleanor tilted her head. "We?" she asked. The word landed harder than any accusation. Thomas swallowed. "For years, I carried us." Eleanor laughed softly. "No," she said. "You carried credit." She handed him a single page, a timeline, highlighted dates, names he recognized. "You taught me that paper remembers." I finally listened. He left without another word. That night, Eleanor stood on the fire escape, city humming below. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. "This is Senator Hale's office. We'd like to speak with you regarding compliance consulting." Eleanor closed her eyes. Power had learned her name, not as a wife, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who could translate consequences. She typed her reply. "My availability is limited. Please coordinate with counsel." She hit send. Inside, Marlene watched her with something like pride. "You okay?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. "I am," she said. "For the first time, I'm not asking permission." Somewhere downtown, Thomas stared at the skyline that once obeyed him. It no longer did. Power had shifted, and it knew exactly who moved it. Truth does not arrive clean. It arrives with invoices, with consequences, with a body count no one talks about. Eleanor learned this the morning the subpoena arrived at Marlene's apartment. Thick, official, impossible to ignore. It wasn't addressed to Mrs. Brooks. It wasn't even addressed to E. Brooks Consulting. It carried her full name, as if the government itself had finally learned how to pronounce her. The hearing room was colder than necessary. That was intentional. Eleanor sat at the long table beneath fluorescent lights that flattened everyone into honesty. Cameras lined the back wall. Staffers whispered. Lawyers organized paper the way soldiers clean weapons. Across the room, Thomas avoided her eyes. He looked smaller. Not defeated, but narrowed. The chairwoman raised her gavel. "This committee is convened to examine irregularities in charitable compliance and fiduciary misrepresentation." The words were dry. Their impact was not. When Eleanor was sworn in, her voice did not shake. She had practiced this. Not answers. Breathing. "Miss Brooks," the chairwoman said, "how did you come into possession of these documents?" Eleanor folded her hands. "I lived with them," she said. A murmur rippled through the room. I organized them, she continued. I questioned them. I was told they weren't mine to understand. Thomas's lawyer objected. The chairwoman overruled. Eleanor didn't look at Thomas. She spoke to the record. I am not here because I was betrayed. I am here because I was trained. The questioning lasted hours. They asked about intent, about benefit, about silence. Eleanor answered what she knew and said, I don't recall, when memory would have been speculation. That restraint mattered. By afternoon, reporters had their headline. Former spouse turns key witness in compliance case. Eleanor read it without reaction. This was the price. Outside, Thomas finally spoke to her. You enjoyed this, he said bitterly. Eleanor stopped walking. No, I endured it. He laughed, sharp and hollow. You always wanted credit. Eleanor met his eyes. I wanted accuracy, she said. That hurt him more. The retaliation was quieter. Clients hesitated. A contract evaporated. An anonymous blog questioned her motives, her morality, her motherhood. Eleanor read every word. Then she closed the browser. Marlene watched her carefully. You don't have to keep doing this. Yes, Eleanor said. I do. Her son called late one night. They're saying you broke the family, he said. Eleanor swallowed. No, she said gently. I broke the silence. He didn't respond, but he didn't hang up either. Weeks later, the settlement arrived. Not generous, just fair. The house? Equity, a clause acknowledging non-monetary contribution. Eleanor signed without ceremony. Closure was administrative. The final hearing concluded without spectacle. No arrests, no handcuffs, just resignations, board reshuffles, quiet disgrace. Thomas disappeared from panels, from features, from influence. On a Sunday morning, Eleanor returned to the brownstone. Her key turned easily this time. The rooms felt different, not haunted, hollowed. She opened windows, let the city back in. That evening, Lily came over alone. I didn't know how to hold two truths. Loving him, seeing you. Eleanor nodded. Most people can't. They sat in silence. It was enough. Later, Eleanor stood in the empty living room and understood something simple and irreversible. Truth costs, but silence costs more. And she had finally paid in full. Power leaves marks. Not the kind you can photograph, the kind you learn to live around. A year passed. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just steadily, like a tide that no longer asks permission. Eleanor's life reorganized itself without ceremony. E. Brooks Consulting expanded quietly. No flashy website, no personal branding. Her work traveled by reputation, passed hand to hand in rooms where trust mattered more than noise. She chose her clients carefully now. She declined as often as she accepted. That was power, too. The brownstone changed. Walls repainted, furniture replaced piece by piece. Not to erase the past, but to stop living inside it. Eleanor kept one thing exactly the same: the dining table. It still bore faint scratches from years of paperwork and children's homework and late-night negotiations no one knew were negotiations. Some surfaces earned their history. Thomas existed somewhere beyond the margins of her life. She learned this the way one learns about weather in a distant state. Occasionally, without emotion. He had taken a position overseas. Advisory. Low profile. No platforms, no panels, no audience. Eleanor did not feel victorious. She felt accurate. Her children found their way back unevenly. Mark came first, quiet apologies wrapped in logistics. Lily followed, long conversations that circled grief before touching truth. They never asked her to be who she was before. That mattered. One afternoon, Eleanor received an invitation she did not expect. A university symposium. Topic: Invisible Labor and Ethical Power. She almost declined. Then she remembered the woman she used to be, the one who thought expertise required permission. She accepted. The lecture hall was full. Students, faculty, professionals taking notes they didn't know how to apply yet. Eleanor stood at the podium, hands steady. She didn't tell her story straight. She talked about systems, about incentives, about what happens when competence is mistaken for compliance. Near the end, a student raised her hand. "How do you make them see you?" she asked. Eleanor paused. "You stop waiting," she said, "and you build something that works without their recognition." The room went still. That night, Eleanor walked home alone. The city hummed, not hostile now, not welcoming, just alive. She passed her reflection in a dark window and almost didn't recognize herself. Not because she looked powerful, but because she looked unafraid. Back in the brownstone, Eleanor opened the folder marked Brooks. She considered deleting it. Instead, she archived it. History deserved a place, but not the present. On a quiet Sunday, Eleanor hosted dinner. Marlene, the children, a few friends who knew her by choice, not by role. They talked about ordinary things: work, travel, weather. At one point, Lily reached for Eleanor's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. Eleanor squeezed back. "So am I," she replied. Later, alone, Eleanor sat at the dining table and opened a blank document. She titled it simply, Accurate. Not a memoir, not a warning, just a record. She wrote for herself, for the woman she had been, for the women who would read between the lines. Eleanor Brooks had been erased once. She would never allow it again. Not because she demanded power, but because she understood something deeper. Power fades. Accuracy remains. If this story stayed with you, remember to like, follow, and share. Some stories don't ask for applause, just witnesses.